celebration book. Fantastic book. We got him up front. We're glad to welcome him here tonight to celebrate the 100th birthday of the most famous jungle resident ever, probably, right?
Yes.
So thank you for coming tonight, and we are ready to go.
Well, thank you all for coming to see me. I'm pretty informal in my talk, so if you have questions as I go through it, we've got about 28 slides, so feel free to raise a hand and I'll recognize you. I'm going to take you sort of through the same format as the book. 28 slides versus over 400 images in the book. So it's just sort of a history of the Tarzan franchise, and I will tell you a little about how it came to be. We've got the logo.
I gotta rewarm this thing up.
Okay, I'll just start chatting then.
Taking a nap. So maybe you can give us a little background.
Okay. I discovered Tarzan when I was probably about 4 years old. My brother had that lunchbox from the 60s, the green one with Tarzan fighting the lion on one side and the gorilla on the other. And I was kind of fascinated. I grew up on a farm, and I was fascinated with animals in general, and who is this guy with these animals. And so I asked my parents if we had any books about it, and they had a pretty good library, but they didn't have any Tarzan books. So I was about 9. I grew up in a town of 12,000 people. And it was a university town, fortunately. We got a retail bookstore, and I walked in, and they had all the Ballantine paperbacks. They had the Neil Adams and the Boris Vallejo covers. And so I stared at them, longingly for it seemed like all afternoon. And finally I settled on Tarzan of the Apes #1. I wanted to not jump into the middle, even though some of the other covers were more appealing. I wanted to start with #1. And so as a 9-year-old, I was kind of wrestling with that text written in 1912, but made my way through and then just voraciously read and reread the books. So I come at it really as a fan of author Edgar Rice Burroughs and his writings. Did not see the films and that stuff until later. Started collecting, started getting the comic books, and they were reprinting the newspaper strips. Yes?
How many books were there in the original series?
There are 24, and the 24th one actually has 3 shorter stories, novellas in it. So there's 26 stories. And of course, then there are the 2 Tarzan twin stories, which were for juveniles, which aren't generally reprinted. Burroughs actually regretted writing the Tarzan twins because he said it didn't work because he wrote down to children. Children normally just picked his books up and read them anyway. And so he thought that was kind of a failed experiment writing for children. And he would just stick with what he knew and write the novels. So it's generally considered 24 novels. And so when I moved out to California, I wanted to write a screenplay about it, and I contacted ERB Inc. and didn't get much traction until one day, I guess one of my letters came across Stanton Burroughs' desk, Burroughs' grandson. He was a huge, proponent and advocate of the franchise. And Danton and I became friends, and socially and through Burroughs gatherings and so forth. And when Danton got Parkinson's, like his father and his grandfather before him, and he started declining, he started asking me to stand in for him on documentaries. And so when they would film documentaries, I would be sort of the talking head Burroughs expert. And so I just sort of built my resume that way, and I was writing articles for the movie magazines whenever there was anything remotely Burroughs, a TV show or a movie. I was writing it up and just sort of worked my way up the feeding chain. And so when the centennial was coming up, I pitched the book to ERB Inc. Unfortunately, Danton died the night before he was going to become president, and Jim Sullis was going to become chairman of the board after years of sort of the doldrums for the franchise. They weren't putting a lot of product out in the 90s, and things had been kind of sluggish. They finally had a changing of the guard there, and since then, that was 2008, the past 4 years, they've really sort of changed directions. We had the Disney's John Carter film that came out. We've had a lot of licensing and marketing, and they really celebrated the centennial. Last year. Is that, do we need to reboot?
I'm working on it right now. It's giving me a little bit of grief. I apologize.
I'll just keep talking. So the time came and I went in and I pitched it to them and I said, let me write this book. I'm the guy to tell this story. They had some other offers on the table. They've always got publishers coming saying, we want to reprint the Tarzan novels, or we want to do this with the character or that. And film producers, and I think the deals on the table, or the people who wanted, were some large publishers, but they just wanted a book of images. And I said, well, you've got to use this opportunity to tell the story of Burroughs and Tarzan. And I understand that for a coffee table book, you'll see, when you see the book, I tried to keep the text in smaller, discrete sections to make it very friendly. And you can kill the light now if you want.
And ladies and gentlemen,
Yay!
yeah.
So they signed me up as a work for hire. I'm actually was hired by the Corporation Commission, and then they went out and found a publisher, and the publisher pays me through them. So it's been a very happy relationship. They gave me, pretty much creative leeway, and of course I'm very respectful of them and the franchise for doing that. So this is the logo for the Centennial. That's a redo of the Crinkle, which of course Crinkle, you've probably seen this image several times. St. John did a similar image back in the pulp days. There was another one, and the author eludes me, the artist eludes me. He's in my book. It was actually on the pulp cover. It was the first time this image appeared, and then St. John did it, and Crinkle did it, and that was on the Bourbon Forges, and they've sort of redone that, and we can go on now to the next one. And that's Edgar Rice Burroughs, born in 1875. This was taken in 1916, probably in Oak Park, Illinois, sort of at the height of his success and powers. He could afford a nice, expensive studio portrait there, because things were going gangbusters for him. He was selling everything. In 1914, I believe he wrote 450,000 words and sold every word. Something like 10 pulp stories. And some of you probably know his background. One reason I find his work so fascinating is it was informed by real life experience. He wasn't, so many movies today are derivative of other movies because the screenwriter sat in film school and learned his trade by seeing what other people put on the screen. But of course, you go back to directors like William Wellman and W.S. Van Dyke, and these were guys of adventure who would go out and have adventures, and they brought that to their work and their art. Burroughs was born to wealthy parents, but when he was 15, he was sent out to Idaho to his brother's cattle ranch, and became a cowpoke. They were trying to get him away from the epidemics in Chicago, but he was getting a little too unshorn and wild, and they pulled him back and sent him to Andover, and he didn't do well there. He was class president, but he was failing, so they pulled him out and put him in military school. And he flourished in military school with the discipline. And he actually was an instructor there for a year after graduation. And then he joined the cavalry, 7th Cavalry. He asked for the toughest post, which was the most post with the most privation, really. He was in Arizona chasing Apaches, and he had dysentery most of the time. So after about 10 months, he mustered out for health reasons and just bounced around. Tried gold mining in Idaho. He was a policeman in Salt Lake City. He did all kinds of things before finally he was 36 years old, trying to sell patent medicine and pencil sharpeners and all this stuff door to door, and it wasn't working, and he was desperate. And so on the backs of old letterhead, he wrote Princess of Mars. We can, I guess, go to the next one here. And this is a photo of him. That's as a cowboy, 15 years old there, and very proud of himself. This is the May Have Seen Better Days Club at Fort Grant, Arizona, with his group. One of his friends' name was Carson Napier, and he later named, of course, his hero of Venus after his cavalry friend. And
Which one is he in the category?
I
Right.
believe, I'm not sure.
It's hard to
I'm not sure. Yeah, they all. It's the guy with the mustache.
Oh. It's probably him top riding now.
Yeah. I'm not sure. In fact, I have seen in Burroughs' writing him referred to Napier, and I don't know if he was really a Carson Napier or just a Napier. Lore tells us that his name was Carson Napier, but the letters I've seen, Burroughs just comments about Napier. So we can. On there we got. So his first book was Princess of Mars, And, it was about the Confederate cavalryman who is transported mystically to Mars, and where the gravity is lighter and he can bounce around and rescue the princess. Finally, after 100 years, Disney brought it to the big screen this past March. And it's really a beautiful film. It did not do so hot box office-wise. $250 million they spent on it, and that's why it didn't earn back. I guess it did for $150 million. If it were a $150 million film, it would have been fine. But for $250 million, they didn't make back their money. So it's kind of in limbo now. We don't know if they're going to go with the trilogy as planned, or let it go, or what's going to happen. Disney's kind of mum on it.
So the book came out in 1912?
The first pulp magazine story, right, February through March of 1912 it was published. He started writing in 1911. Started writing Tarzan in December of 1911. After Princess of Mars, the editor liked it so much he asked him to write something in the Ivanhoe vein, a medieval story, and he wrote Outlaw of Towne, but the editor didn't like it and rejected it. So he decided, I'm going to make one more last gasp. I've sold one, I've had one rejected that I, wrote to their specifications. So that's when he wrote Tarzan of the Apes, starting in December of 1911. Wrote it out in longhand, finished it in May 14th, I believe, of 1912, and mailed it off. And the response was very enthusiastic. The editor said he read it in one sitting. He said all the other editors read it, they loved it, and they weren't going to serialize it. They were going to publish it complete in one issue. We can go to the next one. And
There we go.
that's it. The Osprey Magazine, October 1912, Tarzan of the Apes, A Romance of the Jungle. Clinton Petty cover. This was the first appearance of Tarzan, and Jim Solis over at ERB Inc. always wonders why Action Comics is so expensive and Tarzan Comics haven't appreciated. Well, that was the first appearance of Superman. It's always the character's first appearance that's worth the most. And although Tarzan Comics may not appreciate like Action Comics, this is the most valuable pulp magazine in existence. There are maybe 10 or 12 of them with the cover left intact and in good shape like this. And Bob Zeuschner, who lives up in Sierra Madre, a big Burroughs collector up there, sold his a while back. I believe his bought about $30,000. They bring anywhere from $30,000 to up to $60,000.
You know what
This
condition it was
magazine.
in?
What's that?
You know what condition it was in?
It was in pretty good condition. I mean, it had some creases and stuff. He probably bought it down here on Hollywood Boulevard in the 50s.
Yeah.
When he was a kid, he would come down here and he would go to all the bookstores back when there were bookstores all over the place and say, you got any Burroughs? And so this was his childhood collection. And I'd seen it. I've held it. It was nice. I've seen George McWhorter's. There's not too many of these floating around, but quite a nice artifact. And of course that paper's just crumbling and you can't really read it. But in a slipcase, it's certainly nice to look at. He had a nice box it was in. So we can go on to the next one. Oops, back to St. John. So Tarzan really took off like gangbusters. They immediately wanted a sequel, and Burroughs started writing a sequel to that, a sequel, Gods of Mars, to the Barsoom franchise, and started his Pellucidar series, and his career just took off. He started selling everything, quit his day job, or day jobs, and became a full-time writer, successful writer. And J. Allen St. John is probably the best remembered artist from that era. Burroughs' personal favorite. This is Tarzan and the Jewels of Opar from the book Dust Jacket, and Tarzan, Lord of the Jungle, rescuing Bogani the gorilla from Kista the Python. And so this is a sample of what's in my book. I have tried to get most of the first book appearance jackets and the first pulp appearance jackets or covers. And Phil Norman has done restorations on the old McClures, and so we used his art. He has, it's just incredible. He does facsimile dust jackets and sells them out of Denver, restorations.com. So he gave me his images, high-res images, so that I could show the jacket as it would have appeared back then. And we can go to the next one there.
Who's his book publisher?
Who's that?
Who was his book publisher?
Burroughs? He
Yeah.
started out with McClure. The Tarzan, as I mentioned,
Whoops.
you can go to Frazetta. The pulp came out in 1912, but he couldn't get a publisher at first. And he went to McClure, which was a hometown publisher. They had a large bookstore there in Chicago, prestigious bookstore, and so he tried to get them interested, and they weren't interested. And a couple of things happened. The newspapers back then, of course, newspapers would print fiction to compete with the pulp magazines, and so they started printing it without paying him. His contract with the pulp magazine gave them all rights, which he was very upset about, and he never again did that because they serialized Tarzan all over the country for $50 a pop. And in the later succeeding stories, Burroughs was able to get $300 per story for newspapers, in Oregon or wherever to run it. So Tarzan started being published in the newspapers, and McClure's customers started asking for it, and Burroughs had befriended one of the proprietor of the bookstore there, McClure's bookstore, and so he started pushing the editors, hey, yeah, we really need to publish this, and Albert Pace and Terhune came on board, became friends with Burroughs and wrote McClure, and so in 1914 was the date of the first hardback publication. And the hardback book, I couldn't give you a price as it's all over the map, but a nice one in jacket, and of course the jacket is everything. You could probably get one without the jacket for $1,000 or less, but to find one in jacket would be what appreciates the price. But yeah, so 1914, McClure started publishing. They published the first 4 Tarzans and then the Mars, and wound up doing the first 11 Tarzan books before Burroughs decided, well, I want to publish myself. And sort of as an interim, he had 4 books published by Metropolitan, who were doing the newspaper comic strips around 1928, 29. They did Tarzan at the Earth's Core and Tarzan and the Lost Empire. And then with his 14th novel, Tarzan the Invincible, Burroughs started publishing himself. And this was a time when people like Upton Sinclair and Mark Twain, they had not been able to launch their own publishing in print. Burroughs actually did that, had his own distributors that would get the book into the Macy's department stores and everything. And so he was very successful at publishing his own novels. And so after that point, after Tarzan the Invincible, he was the first edition publisher. This brings us up to sort of the 1960s, some of the images probably that we're more familiar with. Frank Frazetta. In 1962, in the paperback boom, some editors decided that Burroughs was in the public domain and the copyrights hadn't been renewed. Well, the copyrights had been renewed, and of course Tarzan is doubly protected by trademark. And so they had a flurry of little ace paperbacks. This is Tarzan and the Lost Empire and The Son of Tarzan, images that are in the book here. They came out, and these just exploded in popularity. I mean, paperbacks were selling, I'm trying to remember the figures from Life magazine, but they figured 1 out of every 10 paperbacks sold was a Burroughs novel. And there were something like 30,000 Burroughs novels a month selling. So this really exploded Burroughs. He'd sort of gone dormant after his death. His children didn't name a successor, and they still had the rights to the books, which were in print in their warehouse. So they didn't have any big publishing contracts. And when they saw what was taking off with the paperbacks, they decided, well, we'd better get in on this and start publishing mass market paperbacks. So we can go to the next one. Abbot came out after Frazetta once they licensed them. That's The Beasts of Tarzan, Tarzan and the Golden Lion. This was a treasure. When I went into ERB Inc. and said, I want to do this book, and they have an image gallery, and they said, well, these are our images, and this is what we have. And they had bought a lot of these original canvases over the years. And there's some very tragic stories associated, of course, with pulp art. For example, the syndicate that licensed the Tarzan big newspaper comic strips by Hal Foster and Vern Hogarth, the warehouse caught fire and burned up a lot of the old Foster originals. So Foster originals are hard to come by. The Pulp magazine paintings a lot of times were just thrown away. They would reproduce them and toss them out. And St. John was able to, I believe, he had heard that they were liquidating all their old canvases. So he took a taxi across town and ran upstairs and just started carrying down armloads of his canvases. So St. John was able to save a lot of his work. And but there's so much of the pulp art, probably 90% of it is lost, the originals. But we've been very fortunate that a lot of the Burroughs has survived. And what we found with the 60s was that they had these original canvases, the Robert Abbott canvases. And so I went in and they had them, and so we had the photos they had taken weren't of sufficient resolution for the book, so they had to lay them out on a flatbed and have the camera brought in and had them, they were too big for a scanner, had them photographed digitally. So we've got some really beautiful Abbott reproductions in the book. Most of his 20-something canvases are in here. And another thing I wanted to do with this book with the publisher was full bleed. I didn't want Tarzan in a little white box. I wanted the art spilling off the page. And they said, well, we've got to have an oversize. We can only blow it up 10% without getting pixelization and losing the resolution. So we had everything we could photographed oversized for the full bleed art you see in here. We can go on to the next one, Dan. And this was the 70s. This was there on the left is the one I discovered, Tarzan of the Apes. Classic scene of Turcos the Apes kidnap Jane and Tarzan's coming to her rescue, and then Tarzan battling the Leopard Man. This was one of the ones that was sort of competing for my attention because just a fascinating, these guys dressed in leopard skins battling Tarzan. And of course that's based on true life. In the 1930s, there was a cult in the Congo, the Anyoto or the Leopard Man, who would dress up in leopard skins or bark cloth spotted like leopard skins, and it was an assassination society. They would kill political enemies and then mark them up the bodies like they had been killed by leopards and cut off parts of them for cannibalistic orgies and rituals. And so Tarzan goes up against the Leopard Man, and same thing with the Tarzan and Paludan, Tarzan the Terrible, when he goes into the land of the prehistoric animals. Of course, today there's still rumors of a dinosaur or a prehistoric animal, Mokili Mabembe in the Congo. And people were sending Burroughs, his fans were sending him these newspaper clippings. And so a lot of his stuff was informed on the science of the day or the pseudoscience of the day, and I've included sidebars in the book to sort of bring some of that out, that it was tremendous imagination on his part, but he was pulling from what he was reading about in the newspapers every day. So we can go to the next one, Ben.
So was he much of a traveler himself?
He was not. Burroughs never made it to Africa. And except for going back and forth around the United States, he did love to travel, but all his travel was domestic. And then when he became wealthy and he married Florence, his second wife, of course, they would go to Hawaii and Yosemite and Grand Canyon and Death Valley. He liked to take his family on all these sort of iconic American trips, but he never made it to Africa. He did propose going to Africa, to Ethiopia, to sort of report on the local customs. He was trying to get a book deal where they would send him there, and he would write newspaper dispatches, and he would gather material for a Tarzan novel. And that never got off the ground. He decided he had too many business ventures with his real estate and the radio show and the newspaper strips and everything. He couldn't leave his business for that long. So that was travel to Africa was an unfulfilled desire on Burroughs' part. But he gets a bad rub from everybody for his sort of stereotypical pulpy jungle. But he did rely on, Stanley's In Darkest Africa. He relied on, and probably Du Chailu's studies of the gorillas. He relied on the travel logs of the time, and he didn't just make it up out of whole cloth. He really did try to research and give you an idea of what Africa was like at the time when it was, the dark, mysterious continent. This is Boris Vallejo. There, Tarzan the Magnificent and Tarzan and the Lost Empire. The Roman centurions. Of course, Tarzan in the novels was always finding these little pockets of hidden civilizations. And I really like the Lost Race tales because, it was a time when the Earth was unmapped, large sections of it. And we didn't know what was in the darkest Africa or the middle of the Saudi desert or down in Antarctica or above the Arctic Circle. And So there's a very romantic notion to finding these lost civilizations and sort of the lone man against these corrupt ancient civilizations. We can go to the next one. There. Joe Jesco, contemporary, really came to prominence in the early 90s with his Marvel masterworks, these sort of hyper-muscular, hyper-real images of Marvel heroes. And so he came out with these paintings circa 94, 95. And that's Tarzan and Law from when he's rejected Law and the return of Tarzan, and battling Numa with Jane in the foreground there from Tarzan and the Jewels of Opar. And so, and Joe has been commissioned. He's doing 4 new paintings for the Burroughs family to commemorate the centennial. One of them has been out there on the internet. It's Tarzan giving the ape call over a dead, huge gorilla. But Joe continues to just improve and get better and better with age. So these are some of the more contemporary images of Tarzan. Children's editions. I touch on the children's books. This is from...
He looks a little skinnier.
Yeah, that's a big little book from the 1930s. Better little book, it says. They adapted... Tarzan was very popular for Whitman. They adapted most of the first, I think, 14 novels and several of the movies and biographies of Johnny Weissmuller. And so Tarzan was a very big seller for big little books. And that's from the 60s, sort of Tarzan and the Baby Animals. So Burroughs didn't want his franchise to sort of get dumbed down for children. He always maintained that he wrote it for adults. It was fine for children. But he was a little leery of the children's adaptations. But he did let Stephen Schlesinger, who of course was the representative for the Winnie the Pooh franchise, who took Winnie the Pooh to prominence and allied them with Disney. So Schlesinger was doing these Tarzan books in the 30s, and Tarzan really sort of paved the way for our marketing of all the superheroes who came after him. You know, Superman and Batman and Lone Ranger and everybody who was on all these different platforms. It was really pioneered by Tarzan. So we can go on to... And these are some of the comic pages. That's a full-page Foster, Hal Foster, and a full-page Hogarth there. This is sort of towards the end of Foster's reign, maybe around 1935. Tarzan battling a crocodile, and then this is Tarzan and another one of those exotic lost civilizations against the Sultan, who's in league with the Nazis there in the 1940s. And of course, back then the color strips would be a full page. This might be the back page of the comics section. And it was a big seller, very popular. We're fortunate that some of the greatest artists of the 20th century in their various mediums have illustrated Tarzan. Because of course we don't have this kind of newspaper comics anymore. The World War II paper shortages really put an end to that. And Tarzan was never the same. They cut him down to half page and tabloid. And he continues. We can go on to... This is Gray Marlowe from the 1996. I actually wrote this. I was the writer one summer on the strip. And so this is Gray and my collaboration. That on the right, an interesting point, that's Bob Hyde, who was the president of the Burroughs Bibliophiles. He went on safari to Africa, and he sent his safari photos to Gray, and Gray wrote him in as the villain. And this piece has been lost. I spent most of what the syndicate paid me buying Gray's originals. Gray got 5, and Irving Inc. got 4, and the syndicate kept 4, but this one was lost. Bob wanted it, and I wanted it. And neither one of us came up with it. The syndicate said it was stolen in transit. So this is a hot piece of art that is much desired by us collectors. And we can go on. Comic books, Tarzan and the Devil Ogle, Tarzan and the White Savages of Bari. Of course, the early comic books were those newspaper strips I showed you. They would bind them, reprint them and bind them in anthologies. And then Dell started producing original comics. And these are the first 2 original Tarzan comics that were written just for the comic book medium. It was a Dell 4-color. This was, again, sort of an anthology title. They would publish numerous heroes every month, Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck and Lone Ranger. And Tarzan got a couple of titles before. He sold, I think, close to 500,000 of each of these titles in a little over a month. And so they decided Tarzan deserved his own title. And these are 1947 and 48, I believe. So by late 48, 49, Tarzan had his own title, and it's been published off and on ever since. So. next one. This is DC Comics. Of course, they were huge in the 70s. Batman, home of Batman and Joe Kubert. And then it went over to Marvel with John Buscema. And that's, you'll recognize that as a sort of an homage to Clinton Petty's original Paul. He's put a pretty girl in the place of William Cecil Clayton there that Tarzan's rescuing from the lion. But these were the comics of my childhood, so we sort of touch base on those in the book. And go on films. Tarzan was in the silence. That's Elmo Lincoln, the Tarzan of the Apes, very first appearance of Tarzan on screen in 1918, which is screening, as Jeff said, in 2.5 weeks.
On the 16th.
The Egyptian, yes. And that's Jim Pierce, who went on to marry Burroughs' daughter and became Burroughs' son-in-law and helped run the corporation and was the voice of Tarzan on the radio. We can go on to the next one.
Well,
I
what
believe
film company was doing these first Tarzan films?
they were independent, most of them.
Who was producing them?
Well, William Parsons, Burroughs.
This was Burroughs' company that was producing them?
No. Around 1914, Burroughs started trying to sell Tarzan, and he couldn't find a taker. So most of these silents were little independent outfits. First National with William Parsons produced Tarzan of the Apes. The Weiss brothers produced them, who later went on, I think, to work with Universal. Universal did the 2 Frank Merrill serials. So they had a little bit better budget and production value. The Elmo Lincoln one did very well. It's one of the first 6 silent films to earn over $1 million and played to sold-out houses on Broadway. It was playing multiple theaters. Back then, a lot of films didn't do that, play in 3 theaters on the same street, but they were putting, Elmo was one of the first films to command several theaters in the same district. And we can go on to the next one. Radio, that's Jim Pierce, a little chunkier there. A few years later, he's got Burroughs' daughter in front of him as Jane. That's a publicity still from the radio show that they did in 1932, 1934. That takes us to MGM. Johnny Weissmuller and Maureen O'Sullivan, the most famous Tarzan and Jane. And so Burroughs was never really thrilled with how Tarzan appeared on screen with the silence, because it was kind of small, shoestring budget type affairs where they never really had enough money to promote, and they would do well once they got in theaters, but Burroughs wasn't happy with the production value and what they did with his character and so forth. But MGM, of course, was the most powerful and popular studio at that time, and they came to him and they said, we want to make Tarzan. They had sent Woody Van Dyke to Africa to shoot Trader Horn, and he had over 1 million feet of unused footage left over. And they said, well, we've got to do something with all these animals running around, 1 million feet of footage. Let's get me, Irving Thalberg said, get me another jungle picture. And so they came up with a deal with Burroughs, bought the Tarzan character. One stipulation, though, Burroughs said, you can't adapt my novels. I'm done with selling my novels and the frustration. You can have the name Tarzan. They have a certain code of honor that Tarzan has to follow. And you can take the Tarzan franchise and do your own story with it. And just pay me and I'll be happy. And he was fairly pleased with Weissmuller and O'Sullivan for what it was, with their performance. And she was very charming. I know he did some book signings and so forth with her. They were very charismatic, huge box office hits, the first 2. The third one, Tarzan Escapes, is where the franchise sort of lost its footing. They had these big devil bats that were attacking in the swamps because Tarzan was trying to lead the people out, and children were so scared they were crying and wanting to go out of the theater and stuff in the test screenings. So they scrapped it and they recut it, and that's when they brought in the treehouse with the elephant elevator and the big ostrich omelets, and sort of dumbed it down for children. But the first 2 films did have a lot of really scary elements. They were competing against King Kong and films like that. So
And a little more sexy, too.
yes, very sexy. They had the nude swimming sequence in Tarzan and His Mate, which was doubled by Josephine McKim, the Olympic swimmer. It's not Maureen nude, but that footage was censored, and then I think Ted Turner restored it in the 90s, so we can see it now on the releases, about a 3-minute nude swimming sequence.
So what was the first MGM Tarzan called?
Tarzan the Ape Man.
Tarzan the Ape Man.
Right, 1932, and it was followed in 1934 by Tarzan and His Mate.
Okay.
And I believe the budget for both of those was close to $1 million, around 950,000, I'm going to say. And or maybe 650 and then 950. yeah, they really put a lot of money into it. And then once the Tarzan Escapes sort of, floundered in production and they made it for children, then they brought in Boy, did a total of 6 MGM films. And Boy was going to replace Jane. They killed Jane off initially, but the studio tried to. But again, the screening audiences, raised a hue and cry, and they figured we can't do that, so they used the alternate ending where Jane recovers from the spear wound for 2 more movies. And then Saul Lesser took over the franchise after this, kept Johnny Weissmuller and Johnny Sheffield's contracts. Maureen O'Sullivan left. Saul cranked out 6 more Tarzan films with Weissmuller and then went to Barker and sort of used the same formula. It was so successful for the kiddie matinees. Saul was making 75% of his gross overseas. I mean, they were hanging sheets in the South American pampas and villages in the Middle East and Africa and anywhere people would gather to watch these things. Huge popularity overseas. We can go to the next one.
Tracy, sorry, just one question just about the
Yes.
King Kong. Because King Kong is 33, isn't it? Because it's midway between the first 2.
Right,
Tarzans.
right.
Was it made, or is there, what do we know about the connection between King Kong and the 2 early Tarzan films?
I haven't found any hard evidence where the producers of Tarzan and his mate said we've got to rival King Kong.
Sure.
A lot of film historians believe that was the case.
Right.
When they saw King Kong. Because Tarzan and his mate is extremely violent, of course. They were shooting the lions on screen. Of course, these were culls. They had the big lion farms here in Southern California, and the lions breed extremely prolifically in captivity. You throw a few steaks at them, and you'll have more lions than you know what to do with in short order. And so when the lions would get old or whatever, they would have a marksman shoot them and shoot them on camera. And these are the lion deaths you see in the film. And they had guy Melvin Kuntz and some other people people would go out to the lion farms and he would wrestle the lion, and he's the guy who doubled Weissmuller. They got the Cadonas, flying Cadonas, trapezes and everything, doubling Weissmuller. So yeah, they spared no expense in getting whatever stunt man they needed. And Weissmuller was able to do the swimming. They had the big mechanical crocodile, and so, yeah, I haven't seen any hard physical evidence that the producers said we've got to top Kong, but a lot of film historians feel like that was sort of Kong raised the bar.
Yeah.
And
Well,
for
was
this
Kong
one,
in its own way still a reaction to the success of the first one too, do you think, or not?
Well, they were going to do Tarzan and his mate it was due to the success of the first one, but it did up the everything, the violence, the sex, the adventure. So I guess the feeling, it was just one of those rare sequels that I think tops the predecessor. And
Thanks.
so, yes, definitely one of the high points of the series, along with the 2 Gordon Scott films. That's the happy family, Cheetah on the end there, and Maureen and Johnny and little Johnny. And of course they've got Cheetah on the other side from Maureen because he would take a bite out of Maureen whenever he could. He was very attached to Johnny. And there's probably a rope to Cheetah's leg tying him down too. They would do that trick. Sometimes in an old still you can see Cheetah's got a leash on his leg or something to keep him from jumping on Maureen. And of course chimps, know who the alpha male is, and they're always trying to work their way up the chain, so whoever's not alpha male is in line for a biting. We can go to the next one. Saul Lesser. This is one of my favorites, Francis Gifford from Tarzan Triumphs. This was immediately after Maureen left the series, and Saul was hoping she would come back, so they had Jane up in England helping the troops with the war effort. And Florence comes to Tarzan, and her people the Nazis have invaded her lost realm, seeking tin and copper and all sorts of natural resources. So she asks Tarzan, and Tarzan's a metaphor for the United States. He won't get involved. He's like, not my deal. And finally they kidnap Boy, and he has sort of a personal motive, and he says, now Tarzan make war. And the audiences went nuts, and he just unleashes hell on the Nazis. And this was made with the State Department's approval and possibly money from the State Department. Saul said this was his most profitable movie ever, was Tarzan fighting the Nazis. And so within 9 or 10 months, they released Tarzan's Desert Mystery with Nancy Kelly, sort of a retread, where only this time it's the Nazis are up in the desert with an Arab tribe and causing trouble and havoc, and Tarzan goes in and rescues them. And then after that was when Saul gave up on Maureen O'Sullivan and brought in Brenda Joyce. So we can go. This is the Cy Weintraub. And Saul, of course, was doing these films geared to children and extremely profitable. He was happy, Burroughs was happy, but Cy Weintraub was a young, ambitious television producer from New York who thought the series could be a lot more. So he bought Saul out for $3 million, got Gordon Scott's contract, and then he made Tarzan's Greatest Adventure and Tarzan the Magnificent, which these films are really westerns. The western was popular at the time, and it's Tarzan and this band. There's a band of desperados, and Tarzan's got to take the desperados to justice while at the same time keeping this disparate group of travelers safe and healthy, and it's causing Tarzan all kind of headaches.
So when was the last Weissmuller film?
The last Weissmuller would have been Tarzan and the Mermaids, 1948.
Okay.
And then Lex Barker took over 5 years in a row, 49 to 53, a different Jane in every film. Then Gordon Scott did 3 for lesser, before Weintraub took over. And then he hired, we have Jock Mahoney in between here, but that's Mike Henry, former player for the Rams, did 3 films in a row in South America, and was supposed to do the Ron Ely series, but after 3 films was in such bad health, said, I'm done. And Ron stepped in and filmed the series. And Ron wrote my foreword. Ron was not, did not like to talk about his Tarzan experiences for many years. And so finally, he sort of came out and started doing the shows a couple of years ago. And Jim Sullis, the president of Earby Inc., and I went and pounced on him and said, Ron, will you write the introduction to this book? Because he's a very eloquent man. I had read his press releases back when he was doing the series and things he'd said about Tarzan, and I knew he was very eloquent and well-spoken, not just about the character, but his bigger place in history. We can go on. The modern era. That's Denny Miller, oldest living Tarzan. He's a fan favorite, still alive. I've made a few appearances with him. And Joanna Barnes there in the 1959 remake of Tarzan the Ape Man. And of course, now they had leftover footage from King Solomon's Mine, color footage from Africa, that they wanted to recycle. So they remade it, and Denny kind of got the short end of the stick on the special effects and everything. They hauled the crocodile that Weissmuller wrestled out of storage, and it was foam rubber. It was rotting and falling apart, and it just sank like a submarine when Denny pounced on it. And so they tinted the Weissmuller footage and used it's Weissmuller there that Denny is fighting the crocodile in Denny's movie, and then Denny is battling a stuffed leopard, and they do a close-up on the leopard's little bead eyes, little fake eyes when he's stabbing it. And then, of course, Christopher Lambert, Greystoke, 1984, a modern take, or a serious take on Tarzan. And we can go on. Very successful. Nominated for an Oscar for the screenplay, and Robert Towne was so upset. He was going to direct. Greystoke was going to be his directorial debut. That was his passion project. He went just page by Burroughs' original novel and plotted this story out. And then the studio took it from him and gave it to Hugh Hudson, and Hugh Hudson developed it, and he was heartbroken. So he put his dog's name on the movie, P.H. Fazak, and Robert Towne's dog was nominated for an Oscar. And so the Greystoke, all the stuff in England is Hugh Hudson. Robert Towne's stuff is the African stuff, which those of us who are sort of fans of the Burroughs novels, we love the African stuff, and that's Robert Towne for you, triple Oscar nominee and Oscar winner. That's Caspar Van Dien, 1998, Tarzan and the Lost City. This started out as the sequel to Greystoke and was about 14 years in gestation and went through numerous scripts, and you can see a few traces that it's supposed to be sort of the after story of Greystoke, but it was okay. It was a solid B movie. I liked it. That's Disney's Tarzan, 1999. Of course, Disney was a force unto themselves and negotiated with the Burroughs family to do this big budget animated film, and we call it the Disney Renaissance when they started remaking, or went back into the big budget animated film business in the 90s. They did, I believe there are 10 films in the Disney Renaissance, and Tarzan is ranked number 3 profit-wise. It's right behind Beauty and the Beast. So if they'll re-release it, it might jump to number 2. And of course, The Lion King is far and ahead the most profitable animated film ever.
You skipped Bo Derek.
I did. I did. That was an interesting. The Bo Derek film, interestingly.
I tease you because you mentioned with the comics. I know that
Yes.
you remember you're the right age for that one too.
Yes. The Bo Derek film is interesting in that it was authorized but not approved. MGM retained the rights to make a third remake of Tarzan the Ape Man. And when Bo Derek blew up with 10, they gave her and John the rights to Tarzan, and the Burroughs family blanched. And Greystoke was in production at the time. They were still hashing it out. Would Towne direct? Wouldn't he direct? And they thought it was going to scuttle Greystoke. And the Burroughs family was very upset. And the Burroughs and the Derricks both had the same solution. We'll just take Tarzan off of it, make it a generic jungle movie. But MGM said no way. And a lot of people don't realize this. The movie's sort of tainted as their vanity project and failure. It was a huge commercial success. Huge commercial success. It set all kinds of records for MGMs. 3-day records, weekend records, weekly records, 2-week record, 3-week record. It set all these records for MGM. So yeah, the Bo Derek film was a huge commercial success. And I mention it, but I don't have any stills in here. Because whenever I'd ask Jim Solis, the president of VRB, he kind of hem and hawed. And I'd say, well, what do I do here? Can I include it? Should I include it? So I didn't press him on that. Maybe in the future when we do. We did meet Miles O'Keefe, and he's a very nice guy, and so hopefully the reconciliation will continue with these formerly unapproved projects. This is Tarzan of the TV of the 90s, the era of blow dryers and wind machines. That's Joe Lara and Archie the Chimp from Tarzan in Manhattan. This was sort of like the Weissmuller Tarzan Goes to New York, or Tarzan's New York Adventure. They took Tarzan and did the whole fish out of water thing, and Manhattan. Has to rescue cheetah from a animal research lab, and it was a pilot. Did pretty well as a movie of the week, but not well enough to get the series off the ground. So the resultant series, they sort of did the Weissmuller, took Wolf Larson down to the jungles of Mexico and did a half-hour sort of geared towards kids syndicated show. I believe the Wolf Larson's on Hulu now, if anyone's interested. And of course, we remember the Ron Ely series the best, but those were a couple of nice. Tarzana, of course, was Burroughs Ranch. After he became successful in 1919, he moved out here to sort of keep an eye on the Hollywood thing, and he was wintering out here once he got successful. He came to San Diego one winter and to LA one winter, and decided to just give up the Chicago cold, and bought the 500-acre ranch. That's General Harrison Gray Otis, who was a early publisher of the LA Times. That's the big ranch house there. And as I was mentioning earlier, this 20-acre parcel existed until about 10 or 15 years ago. Ralph Herman's family had it. And they finally subdivided it and put mega mansions on there. Of course, everything else around there now is the city of Tarzan. Everything from there north, that's Ventura Boulevard along the door. That's the old Adore Dairy, for any of you locals who remember Adore, up there in sort of the top center. And that's Burroughs' alfalfa field where he had his livestock. He didn't really make it as a gentleman farmer because there wasn't an aquifer. He had to buy water for the goats and the pigs and all the things he wanted to raise, and couldn't make a go of it. So he sold it off into development, and up along Ventura Boulevard they did the lots. His office is up there, which he built in 1927, which is still there, which is where ERB Inc., the folks still do business out of there. So I got to drive up there about once a month for a couple of years and meet with them about this book. If you ever have a chance to go up there and take a tour, I would advise it, because it's just a wonderful trove of Burroughs stuff. And I think that's about it. The final years, that's Burroughs as a war correspondent. He witnessed Pearl Harbor. He was sort of in semi-retirement there. Moved to Hawaii to get away from, had too many hangers-on and friends and stuff wanting to spend his money, so his son sent him to Hawaii with his young wife, and she didn't like it. Hawaii was a little bit more rustic in those days, and they had lizards and spiders and stuff in their bungalow, and she brought the kids and came back, the stepchildren, and he stayed, and Hully went to visit him, and they witnessed Pearl Harbor, and he joined the Army as a war correspondent, oldest war correspondent in the Pacific, and actually made it down to Sydney, Australia, and southeast, the South Pacific. That's him standing in the tree outside his offices where his ashes are buried, interred under the tree. I think that tree has died, but they've replaced it with a black walnut or something. And so he died in 1950, and the corporation continues on to this day. And I think is that it? Yes. Authorized sequels. It's been a few months since I've done this presentation. That's Jane, the Woman Who Loved Tarzan by Robin Maxwell. It's the Tarzan story from Jane's perspective, which is doing very well. And Tarzan, the Greystoke Legacy. Andy Briggs out of England is doing a series of Tarzan books for young adults. Of course, these young adult series are very popular with young folks, so Andy has rebooted the series for that.
Now, is Tarzan still finding an audience? Obviously, they're still doing something here that's a new audience with young people. Is he still?
Yes,
Continuing
he's still
to be
popular.
popular?
He's not Batman, Superman popular, Spider-Man popular. Andy, I know, just released his third book. He was contracted for 2, and if they sold, he got a third. So we'll see if he gets another 4th. And the Jane it's not selling gangbusters, but it's gotten good reviews, and it is selling and is doing well. So Tarzan sells enough to keep him in business, but certainly I'd like it to be bit higher prominent, more higher profile.
All right, how did Burroughs come up with that great name Tarzan? Anybody know?
Well, we don't know. It's just experimentation. In his manuscript, he wrote Xantar, and he even wrote Tublat-Zan, which was, we know the apes had their whole language, and so he was turning around, creating this language in his head, and he started out with Xantar and Tublat-Zan, and X'd him out and came up with Tarzan. Just very euphonious. He was well grounded in the classics. He had taken a lot of Greek and Latin and so forth as a child. So I think he knew what sounded good to the ear and that so forth and so on. Tried out, originally the Greystokes were going to be the Bloomstokes. Several pages in, he crossed out all the Bloomstokes and made him Greystoke. He had just used a Greystoke in his Outlaw of Towne, so some people say that was actually Tarzan's ancestor, and the Outlaw of Towne is the first Tarzan book because it's the first appearance of a Greystoke. So, any more questions?
And this cover is.
Oh, this is me. This brings us to the end. This is Neil Adams. This is The Return of Tarzan. And they sort of whited it out and made it pop. I was very happy with it. Quite a decision. Titan had seen thousands of pieces of art, and we left it up to them to pick the title because that was, to me, a sales decision. And I said, you show it now. If I'm not happy, I'll tell you. So I was very happy. I think it's very kinetic. It moves. It's got conflict. I think Jim Solicity Erbink was a little leery because Tarzan's killing an animal, and in today's society that's an element that we don't want to necessarily play up. But at Titan they were adamant, this is what we want. We've seen everything. This is what will sell. This is what will get attention. So,
It's a great cover.
What's that?
It's a great cover.
It's very dynamic.
Can't go wrong with Neil Adams.
Did the artist paint it as well? It looks like his illustration style.
It's, I believe it's, I don't know if it's watercolor or gouache. The original painting has got green trees and stuff in the background. So they have digitized that out, the white stuff. It's not on a white background. I've got the original in, I think, yeah, the original's in here. You can compare them. But, yeah, I believe it was either watercolor or gouache that Neil was working in. And they just sort of tweaked it with Photoshop. But very similar. They brought out, the main figures in the foreground.
No, all the artists were pretty much just commissioned artists
Yes.
for the various projects, whatever were done.
As with me, Erbink has always done a work for hire. They've always, with their contract, they own the copyright. And usually the artist keeps the original. Of course, one thing I didn't mention with the comics was we also have the George Wilson covers in here, full-page bleeds of the George Wilson covers, who did the Tarzan adaptations of the novels in the 60s. And they had those original canvases. So right alongside the Abbots, that's some great work. It's never been reprinted without the lettering and in this size and format. So I was very happy to get those. Anybody else?
Is
Yes.
EIB involved with the new Robert Hardy? Isn't it? Not Robert Hardy. Sorry, the Harry Potter director who's now making the new
Yates.
Yeah. Sorry. Thank you.
I don't know. I know they have approval over certain things in their
Right.
contract, and there are other things that they leave up to the studio entirely, depending on how big, how much they're being paid is how much
Sure,
influence they have.
sure.
So
There'll
for
be a
the
couple of years
big
of production,
feature
yeah,
films, I doubt they have veto power over
No.
things like director and star.
Sure.
But they certainly get to see the script and advise on it and say Tarzan wouldn't do this or wouldn't do this. They have a list of about 23 things Tarzan can't do. Cannot smoke, cannot get drunk, doesn't kill wantonly, things like that. And so as long as they adhere to the Tarzan Code of Honor, they pretty much are allowed to do what they want to do as long as they're doing it well.
What do you think though, the last thing we put as far as finances into something recent, maybe the Disney movie as far as Tarzan, based something, yeah, recent.
What do you mean now?
As far as when Jeff brought up what they're bringing out now, new material or something.
Well,
Last
they've
biggest thing I remember, I think, was
right, Disney's Tarzan. They've got this year, sometime this year, they're bringing out a motion capture Tarzan. 3D motion capture. It's done by Constantine Films over in Europe, and they've been working on that for several years.